Hello, welcome to this talk in the ALACT speaker series. ALACT stands for the Association for Informal Logic and Critical Thinking, and I am Donna Warren, Vice President of ALACT. It is my pleasure to introduce to us today Denise Cummins, who is an adjunct professor of neuroscience and psychology at the University of Boulder, Colorado. University of Colorado-Boulder, and she is going to talk to us today about 7 powerful tools for critical thinking. So I will turn it over to Dr. Cummins. As usual, we'll have the talk first and then certainly welcoming questions afterwards. So, Professor Cummins.
Thank you. First off, let me say thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to talk to the group, and hopefully the things I'm saying will be interesting as well as useful. Okay, so let me start off by saying that we are all painfully aware that over the last couple of decades, we've been bombarded with evidence that human reasoning is hopelessly riddled with biases and hence deeply flawed. So much so that sometimes our students think, why bother? We are so bad at reasoning that, it's a given and we should just give up. Or is it? I'd like you to consider 3 separate short scenarios. In 2021, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine did a competition study to try to project the spread of COVID-19 through the UK. And the competitors were very sophisticated computer models, experts in the field, or just average people, okay, just non-experts. And their surprising results were that all of the humans beat the computer models hands down. And there was no difference between the experts and non-experts. So what do we conclude from this? Maybe we're not so dumb, maybe we're brilliant. Okay, well, consider the next case. Okay, if we, in a variety of studies, you present physicians and regular people, non-physicians, all of the information that someone needs to decide whether a patient who has a positive mammogram actually has breast cancer. Now, physicians and non-physicians alike in these studies, in one particular study, they estimated that the likelihood of breast cancer was 80%, when in fact, the likelihood was 8%. That's a 10-fold error in a very important decision. And physicians made the same mistake. So what do we conclude from that? That we're kind of dumb after all? Finally, consider this, one of my favorite studies. MIT started the Moral Machine study that involved 233 countries and 40 million respondents. And the topic was AI in self-driving cars. Now, across the board, across all of these countries and respondents, there was general agreement that self-driving cars should seek to protect, avoid harming pedestrians, even if it meant harming the passengers in the car. Everybody agreed that, but everyone also agreed that they would never purchase a car that was programmed to act that way. Okay, so we've got a problem here. Now, why the hodgepodge of conflicting results? Why do we seem so smart sometimes and so dumb other times? Why is that? Well, I've been teaching philosophy and psychology courses on reasoning and decision-making since 1986, a variety of populations. And I've come to this conclusion. I think the hodgepodge of results is due to the fact that when it comes to critical thinking, students are insulated within their particular disciplines. So for example, philosophy and pre-law majors, okay, are very well trained in logic and argumentation, but they don't know the first thing about scientific reasoning. The science majors are good at hypothesis testing, the hypothetical deductive method, okay, but they don't know anything. They're not very good at argumentation, and they don't know anything about, say, how to make a moral judgment. In the business school, the students are trained in economic theory, and so they understand decision-making and game theory, but they are not very proficient and they don't know anything about scientific reasoning, and they're not very good at logic and argumentation. And outside of psychology, most of the students are not taught that the way the brain is wired shapes the way we think, act, and feel. Now, these students go out, they're bright, they're educated, okay, they become voters, they become employers, employees, and they're required to evaluate and vote on economic, legal, and medical policies when they don't know how to do that. And furthermore, they're judged on the basis of their decisions when they're not even aware of the standards by which they're being judged. Traditionally, we've believed that to empower students to reason critically, we need to teach them how to think logically, and just as importantly, how to spot arguments that sound persuasive but are actually misleading. This is the jewel in the crown of critical thinking, but it's not the only tool, I think, that should be taught. I think we need to expand our critical thinking toolbox in our courses. Now, in Good Thinking, which the second edition came out in 2021, Cambridge University Press, I present 7 tools that I think ought to be taught in courses on critical thinking. Okay, so very briefly, the first, logic and argumentation. What follows from what? The second, analogical reasoning, which has been claimed to be the heart and soul of insight, discovery, genius, and also persuasive argumentation. Okay. Moral judgment. How do you tell right from wrong? Rational choice. How to choose what is most likely to give you what you most want. Game theory. What to do when you're not the only one making choices. Scientific reasoning. Figuring out what causes what and what to do about it. And then finally, problem solving. The search for solutions to unwanted situations. Now, you may already be feeling some pushback because, for at least for some of you, because you may be thinking, oh, this is going to require me to become experts in these areas that are outside of my area of expertise. But I don't think that's the case. I think we just need to be familiar enough with these tools, the tools used in these disciplines, to teach them adequately. Just in the way that, for example, when you teach intro philosophy or I teach intro psychology, we have to teach sub-disciplines within our discipline that we are not experts in. Like for me, I'm an experimental psychologist. I don't know anything about psychopathology or or psychotherapy, but I do need to teach sections on that, and I have become conversant and familiar enough to be able to do that. So I think that's what we need to do in our critical thinking courses to really prepare students so that we don't end up with this hodgepodge of now you see the brilliance, now you see the stupidity. Okay, for the rest of the talk, I just want to go over briefly what I mean for each of these. I won't go over problem solving to save some time. Okay, so first off, logic and argumentation. In his recent talk to this group, Andy Norman pointed out that the mind was shaped by evolutionary pressures to resist information that is harmful to the bearer. That means the mind is tuned to fight off threatening information, not necessarily false information. And a crucial goal of critical thinking is tuning the mind to focus on truth, not just what's advantageous for me. I think that's a brilliant and very keen insight that we need to keep first and foremost in our minds when we teach critical thinking. Okay, that usually means evaluating arguments that are presented to us. But what makes a good argument? As came up in the discussion, Judy Goldier's R's conditions, I think, fit the bill. She argues that premises should be acceptable, relevant to the conclusion, support the conclusion, that is, make the conclusion at least plausible. If you adhere to these simple rules, it's easy to spot common fallacies, such as ad hominem. It really doesn't matter, it is not relevant whether the person presenting the argument is a complete jerk. What matters is, are they making sense? Are they presenting a sound argument that we should take seriously? And also, one trick that I use, we know about, I'm sure you're familiar with the notion of belief bias. That is, people tend to, well, they don't understand what the term validity means, but if you ask them to evaluate arguments, they will accept arguments with whose conclusions they agree with, okay? Implausible conclusions, or ones they disagree with, they tend to just say it's a bad argument. If instead, if you want them to focus on the structure of an argument, then give them arguments that are sound but have implausible conclusions. or what they would think of as implausible conclusions, because they'll say, wait a minute, something doesn't add up. And then they'll go back and they'll start looking at the connections, the entailment connections among the premises. So that is, I think, one trick to get them to actually take seriously the fact that you have to look at the structure of arguments when evaluating whether you should be taking them seriously. Okay, next up, analogical reasoning. Cognitive scientist and Pulitzer Prize winner Douglas Hofstadter described analogy as the core of cognition. In other words, analogy is simply the way the human mind works. And in fact, it's so easy and effortless that you'll probably get this joke. Okay. On the face of it, the plan was simple, like my brother-in-law, Phil. However, unlike Phil, the plan was likely to work. Okay, so analogies require us to compare two things and match their similarities: a deadbeat brother-in-law and a plan. Okay, there's the double meaning of work and simple. Okay, but I didn't need to explain all of that to you. I think you sort of got the joke, even if you're not laughing uproariously. Okay, now this isn't just a parlor trick. Okay, arguments based on analogies are extremely powerful in terms of persuading people. They're very weak in terms of capturing truth. Okay, so example, during the economic downturn in 2008, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke got on television and he wanted to convince the American public that we needed to bail out the mega banks because they were too big to fail. Now, he didn't present facts and figures. He didn't present a logical argument. He relied on analogy. What he said was, okay, suppose you live in a neighborhood of wooden houses. Your next door neighbor is a smoker. He was smoking in bed. He set fire to his house, threatening all the rest of the neighborhood. Now, what should we do? Should we call the fire department to put it out? Okay. Or should we just let him face the consequences of his action, let his house burn down? He said, I think we can all agree in that circumstance, we have to call a fire department. We have to take action and we have to try to save that house. Okay. Now, that was very persuasive to a lot of people, but critics pushed back against this, saying that this was a reckless decision and it was poor reasoning. Okay, but they also used analogy in pushing back. What they said is, no, this is more like you're kicking the people out of the houses in the neighborhood and turning the properties over to the guy who burned down his house. Okay, and so this was also a persuasive argument. Now, the most important question to ask when comparing analogies is this: does the analogy establish a true causal connection? Or is it just a vivid way of presenting an idea? Because they are very powerful, very persuasive. Again, using the arts conditions, I think, empowers us to resist powerful but misleading analogies. Okay, next up, moral judgment. I think, as we're all aware, heated controversies typically are grounded in conflicting moral judgments. When a moral principle is violated, it elicits outrage, or sometimes just frank rage. Neuroscience has shown us that emotion processing areas of the brain are activated rapidly when we make moral judgments, okay? Not so in other kinds of decisions. Now, what is a moral principle? Well, the results of large-scale studies indicate that actually some moral universals do exist across cultures. Okay, the first is harm and care. Okay, which we should not harm the innocent. We should care for each other, and that's rooted in the mammalian emotional attachment systems. And these are the things that underlie the virtues of kindness, gentleness, and nurturance. The second is fairness. Okay, it generates ideas of justice, rights, and autonomy. The third is in-group loyalty, okay, which underlies the virtues of patriotism and self-sacrifice for the group. The next is authority and respect for authority, and that underlies virtues of leadership and followership, including deference to legitimate authority and respect for traditions. And the last one is purity or sanctity, which is related to emotions of disgust that underlie survival enhancing behaviors such as avoidance of contaminated, bad tasting food. This is a foundation that underlies many religious notions of things that are immoral and also striving to live in an elevated, less carnal, more noble way. Now, if we have these moral principles, that gives rise to moral imperatives, which are actions that must be taken because they are the right thing to do. And that gives rise to moral dilemmas, which are situations in which the choices we face pit two or more moral imperatives against each other, such that obeying one would result in transgressing the other. Okay, and what's the easiest way to get this across to students? The trolley problems. Okay, the kids get them, the students get them, most people do. And it's a litmus test. A lot of information, okay, and cognitive differences emerge from this. So the trolley problem, standard one, you've got a runaway trolley headed down this track. There's 5 people on the tracks. They are going to be killed, okay? There's a switch you could push that will divert the trolley to another track. There's only one person standing on that one. Question, should you push that switch? Okay, should you deliberately kill one to save the other 5? Okay, now, generally speaking, universally, most people say, yeah, you should push the switch. You should save 5, kill one to save 5. Okay. On the other hand, okay, there are some cultural differences, but right here at home and abroad, there are huge sex differences in certain of these trolley problems. For example, smother the baby. Okay, you're hiding in the basement. The bad guys are out there, with their guns, looking to come in and kill you and your fellow people who are hiding. Your baby starts to fuss and cry. That's going to alert the bad guys to where you are. Do you smother the baby to keep it quiet? Okay, across the world, men say, "Yep, smother that baby," and women say, "Excuse me, I don't think so. There has to be a different way." Okay, it's a profound effect. Okay, so there are some cultural differences. There are, in terms of cultural differences, we're a very individualistic country, and so we value the individual rights much more strongly than other countries, particularly in the East, who are more collectivist and value social harmony, okay, cooperative action. Okay, here again, differences. Liberals generally focus solely on the first 2 of the moral universals, harm, care, and fairness. So you'll often have liberals justify decisions by saying they're not hurting anyone, or it's not fair that one subgroup should have more rights or privileges than another. Conservatives, on the other hand, all 5 weigh in, which is why they don't think that, for example, homosexuality is just a matter of, fairness. They think that it's impure. Okay. All right. So we find these differences. There's also, whether people realize it or not, prior commitments to certain philosophical schools, okay, moral judgment schools. So some people are consequentialists. They will simply judge the morality of an action based on its consequences, end of story. Nothing else enters into it. Others care more, lean more towards deontology, again, whether they're familiar with that term or not, where the morality of an action is based on whether the action itself is right or wrong under a set of rules, rather than the consequences of the action. And so a lot of disagreement can arise because people hold these different commitments, whether they realize it or not. Okay, students should be made aware of these, okay? Because moral judgment is a thorny but extremely important topic, as we can see going on in the current election, the presidential election. Okay, next up, decision making. Okay, this is where the dozens of biases that plague human decision-making have been well documented. Oh, we've got the representative heuristic and we've got the overconfidence effect and blah, blah, blah. Okay, yeah, students should know about these so they can protect themselves and say, I'm being overconfident or whatever. But really, there are three things that you need to come away understanding about human decision-making. The first is that the part of your brain that is responsible for deliberation and calculation is separate from the part that assesses how happy a choice will make you. And these separate areas compete with each other when you make a decision. When people make risky decisions, okay, the reward areas are usually overactive relative to the deliberative areas of the brain, which is why one reason why gambling can be so addictive. The very act of placing a bet can feel as rewarding as winning. Now, the saving grace is that these two areas operate on different time scales. Okay, the emotion-based, the utility-based areas are fast. They are subcortical and they are fast. The deliberative sections, the prefrontal cortex, is slow. It requires more time. So these operate on different time scales, and if you know that, you can give yourself a break when you feel yourself rushing to judgment, rushing into a decision, realizing that a subcortical part of your brain is driving the car. Slow down, allow yourself time to deliberate, because you will improve decision making in the long time. Excuse me, in the long run. Fast decisions can, go with your gut. They're sometimes right, more often. They're bad judgments, they're bad decisions, but we're overly confident that we made the right choice. The second biggest thing they need to know is that our biases are triggered by the way a choice is framed. So we have loss aversion. This is very important to us. Okay, we don't want to lose. Okay, so if I say, okay, do you want to take this bet or buy this lottery ticket or this raffle ticket or whatever, and I tell you, hey, there's a 20% chance of winning, you're more likely to say, sure, I'll buy in, as opposed to if I say there's an 80% chance of losing. Okay, the way the choice is framed will vastly impact whether you're willing to take that bet. The other thing is frequency versus percentages and probabilities. Okay, if you say 2 out of 10, people get what that means. If you say 80%, they really don't. Percentages and probabilities as a means of capturing quantities has only been around since the 1700s. Tracking frequencies in the world has been around since, throughout evolution. We look out and we see five shirts, not 50% shirts. So if you present data or translate in your head, okay, percentages and probabilities to frequency information, you will really boost decision making. In the studies that I mentioned above about medical diagnoses, you can vastly improve diagnostic success by presenting the data to people, including experts, in terms of frequencies rather than percentages and probabilities. The third thing is what Herb Simon referred to, Nobel laureate Herb Simon, as bounded rationality. Okay, we are satisficers, not optimizers. To be normatively optimal in our decision making requires infinite, complete information and infinite decision making resources, and we just don't have that usually on a daily basis in real life. So instead, we're wired to make the best decisions possible without exhausting all available time and processing resources. If you fret too much about, is this the wrong decision? Is there a better decision out there? You will get paralysis by analysis. A good enough choice saves time, it doesn't deplete mental energy, and it provides an outcome that may not be ideal or optimal, but nonetheless usually delivers adequate benefits. Okay. Next up, game theory. Okay, this is when you're not the only one making decisions. Okay, you're making, other people are making decisions at the same time. And those decisions, you want to take the impact on everybody into consideration. Okay. So a simple example is the the husband-wife scenario where, the one spouse likes basketball, the other one likes movies. And so what do we do tonight? There's a good movie on TV or there's a basketball game. Okay, rational choice, do what you like the best, but what actually you both like the most is being together. Okay, so you take that into consideration when you're making a decision. Okay, now let's back up and ask, what do people mean by the term rational? I just said making a rational choice, making a rational decision. When you ask someone what it means to be rational, most people say logical, coherent, reasonable, calm. That's not what economists mean by rational. And game theory is the darling of economists. Okay, decision-making and game theory. To an economist, being rational means being self-interested, choosing what is best for yourself. Okay, so let's consider then a whole host of studies that an entire enormous body of literature showing that, hey, humans are pretty stupid. Okay, you may be familiar with these. We'll just go over them anyway. Okay, the first one is called dictator. Okay, you and some other person walk into a room, you sit down, the experimenter puts some money on a table, let's call it $100, and says, okay, you're the dictator. You decide what happens with this money. You can take it and leave right now. You can give it entirely to the other person or anything in between. Okay, just make a choice. Now, worldwide, including in hunter-gatherer societies where it's not cash, but it's some other goods, what people do is they will give away 30% to the other person. So $30, here's $30, okay? And you might be thinking now, why were you so stingy? Why didn't you go halvesies, 50-50, right? To an economist, they would say, why were you so generous? Why were you so stupid? Okay, you're supposed to be rational means to make the best choice for yourself, maximize your payoffs, take the money and run. So when people give away 30% on average in the dictator game, economists tear their hair out and say people are irrational. Now, in a slightly different version called the ultimatum game, okay, the other party gets a little power. Okay, so you propose how to split the money. The other person gets to accept or reject. Okay, if the other party accepts the proposal, you split the money, you go home. Okay, if the other person rejects it, however, nobody gets anything. The money stays on the table. Okay, under those circumstances, interestingly, proposers will offer pretty close to 50%. Okay, they're behaving strategically. Okay, why? Because we come into these things understanding something, okay, which is that if people feel that they're being treated unfairly, they will walk. And that's what happens in the ultimatum game. Offers, proposals, proposed divisions that are significantly less than 50%, the money stays on the table. And this is even in countries where a month's salary was on the table. We are very sensitive, okay, to selfishness. We're very sensitive to being taken advantage of. Now, again, economists tear their hair out. Some have introduced norms of fairness and reciprocity, or redefined utility. And that it's, our payoff is not just simply in terms of the money we get, but the pleasure we feel when we behave generously. Okay. So they've introduced these notions to try to explain why people behave the way they do. And this is true even among 6-month-old infants. We come in with a predilection to prefer cooperators and fairness. Okay. In fact, we will pay a penalty, as you saw in the ultimatum game. We will pay a penalty to punish someone who is behaving uncooperatively, who is trying to take advantage of us, given norms of fairness. Neuroscientists have shown us that when we behave generously and fairly, the reward circuitry, lights up, not just when we're being treated that way, but when we treat others that way, or when we see people being treated that way. And the disgust circuitry lights up when selfishness is the name of the game. So the point of this that I think students need to understand is that economic theory valorizes self-interest and selfish choices as rational choice. So from an economist's viewpoint, people are behaving irrationally when they behave fairly and cooperatively. You have to get that through through our heads because this is what our economic policies are based on. This is the bedrock. Okay. Now, why do people generally not want to behave like that? Well, evolutionary biology, I think, is the closest to giving us an answer. They show that cooperators have higher survival and reproductive success rates than cheaters or defectors, as they're called. So when people behave in ways that violate the axioms of rational choice, they're not behaving foolishly. They're giving researchers a glimpse into the pro-social tendencies that made it possible for our species to survive and thrive in not just in our ancient past, but into the present day. Okay, last up, scientific reasoning. Okay, scientists accept two very important points. First, we are always making decisions under conditions of uncertainty. We have incomplete information. Second, knowledge accrues slowly and non-monotonically. You add some new discoveries, you delete some that turned out not to be true after all. That's just the way science progresses. People who distrust science distrust it for these very reasons. They want certainty right now. And that's why they fall prey to those who promise surefire answers with little evidence to back them up. To put it another way, science tells us what we are pretty sure is true up to this given point. Okay, up to this point, given solid evidence. Okay, so that means, okay, this student should be taught the hypothetical deductive methods. Very simple, how you run an experiment, okay, how you analyze it, analyze the data. Very brief, it's not hard to do. But more to the point, this is what they should take away from the course with, okay? When evaluating news reports of scientific findings, ask these simple questions. How large was the study? How large was the effect? Has the effect been replicated by other labs? Did the study go through peer review? Quite simply, you should place more weight on studies that involve large data sets, report large effect sizes, have been replicated by other laboratories, and have gone through rigorous peer review. Pay little attention to studies that do not pass these credibility tests, no matter how exciting the results are. Reports that are based on meta-analyses that combine the results of many studies are typically more reliable than reports based on single or small sets of studies. If you walk away from a scientific reasoning lecture with that, you are greatly empowered to make sense out of the things that you're hearing about whether you should take this supplement or have that medical procedure. Okay, so just to summarize, okay, in Good Thinking, I presented 7 tools that I think ought to be taught in courses on critical thinking. There may be a little pushback because it seems like you have to become an expert in these areas, and I don't think that's the case. I think we just need to become familiar with, conversant with these tools in order to let students know that they're out there. And if they are more interested in one than another, then you can direct them to advanced courses that go into those tools more deeply. And I think if we do this, we have a greater chance of improving, excuse me, human reasoning and avoiding the hodgepodge of contradictory results that I mentioned in the opening of this talk. Thanks a lot. I will open this up to questions and discussion.
Thank you so much. So I just opened the floor.
There's stunned silence.
I guess I have a question.
Okay.
I have a couple actually, but I'm thinking about the hodgepodge effect. And I'm wondering how much of that do you think could be attributed to the fact that human beings are not good at dealing with numbers, right, necessarily. but might be better at dealing with interpersonal interactions. So any argument that requires us to leverage our ability to empathetically and anticipate, for instance, what someone else might do might be easier for us than reasoning that requires us to understand Bayes' theorem, for instance.
I think there's some truth to that because there's in evolutionary psychology and biology there's a thing about the social brain that basically we evolved within small groups and survival depended in large part cooperation and competition within our groups for things like communal looking after cooperative hunting, things like that. On the other hand, there are certain aspects of numerosity that are we seem to be born with. We can tell the difference between small quantities. Okay, it's called subitizing. You know that 5 things is more than 3 things. We're very good at tracking frequencies. Okay, you get as I mentioned, a huge boost if instead of talking in terms of percentage and probabilities, you talk in terms of how many, because we're pretty good at how many. I can ask you, how many times did you how many times did you go for a walk today? Okay, we're pretty good at tracking things like that. So I think it depends on which aspects of numbers you need to be brought to bear in making the decision.
Right. Thank you. Jonathan. Jonathan, I think you have your hands up and you are muted.
Yes. Hi.
Hey.
Yes, thanks for the talk. Really interesting, a lot of food for thought. I was wondering if you think that something like media literacy, which might encompass a treatment of testimony, if that deserves to be a category of its own, or if that would be covered by one of the categories you discussed.
Yeah, testimony, that is a very thorny subject. Particularly, one of the things that we're noticing now is in the past, if you had a picture or you had a video, that was it. It was the truth, right? You could disagree about maybe what you were seeing, but it was there. Now, because of photoshopping, deep fakes, and all the rest of that, you can't provide that kind of testimony and rely on it. Okay. So you have to rely now on what people are saying. And then we get into this business of ad hominem. Should I trust what this person is saying when they are from a different political tribe? Okay, when I don't like them, when I think that they have ulterior motives. My colleague Elizabeth Loftus made quite a career out of damning eyewitness testimony, showing the many, many ways that eyewitness testimony should not be. It's the cornerstone of a lot of legal trials, but it should not be trusted because people's memories are malleable. Okay. If you witness something and then you ask 10 people to write down what they saw, there will be different accounts of what happened. If the prosecutor or defense attorney or even the cop after the event ask questions in just the right way, you can introduce inaccuracies into people's memories. So testimony is vitally important. I don't think we should throw it out. Okay, I think you have to trust that people are doing the best that they can, but we have to take into consideration that memory isn't veridical. Okay, perception isn't veridical. Okay, people remember and they perceive things through the lens of their prior beliefs, and that will oftentimes color what they see and what they saw and what they say. Does that answer your question?
Can I ask you a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking of testimony more in the context of media literacy. So like, I'm more interested in the media literacy part of it. Maybe testimony is important to that, maybe not. But like, so for media,
could you give me an example so I can understand better?
Yeah. So an example would be Reuters publishes an article And the authors say that an anonymous person from the administration said such and such to them. So you're sort of relying on the testimony of the authors that somebody said that. And if you believe that the authors, then you're also relying on the, if you want to infer beyond the claim that that this testimony was given, sorry, that you want to infer from the testimony that the thing attested to happened, there's some reasoning going on there as well, some principles of testimony. So it's in, media reports will have to rely on testimony in various ways. If you talk about war crimes, a lot of evidence for that will be testimony. Testimony is one part of the media literacy puzzle, but there's a lot more to it. I think argument analysis is crucial. Being able to identify what is this article claiming and what reasons is it giving. But I'm wondering if there are some distinctive principles or skills that would be especially useful for media literacy, and if that might merit its own category.
I think that's important because, as we know, people are getting their news from very unreliable sources these days. As we saw recently in the hurricane, things that they were saying about FEMA, are actually endangering people's lives. And this is a problem, okay? But this comes down, oftentimes comes down to people want to live in an echo chamber. They want to hear back what they and members of their own political tribe or ideological tribe believe. And so they are more likely to believe it if it fits in with their prior beliefs. And they won't listen to anything else. With respect to the media, okay, the problem is that there's distrust in the mainstream media now, okay? But the mainstream media and reliable sources like Reuters, okay, or API or NPR or whatever, they take fact checking very seriously, okay? So, and they will fact check by calling up somebody who was present at whatever and asking them to weigh in on it or to give an opinion. And they choose these people either because they know that they were direct witnesses, okay, of the event, or because they hold some position of power and authority, so that they're actually privy to what's going on. This is very different from a lot of the news sources now that people are going to, where people do not have journalistic training. They do not concern themselves with fact checking. And as a result, they can spin. And they spin in extremely persuasive ways, okay? So I think the best we can do in courses in critical thinking is to give people these rules and guidelines, okay, that consider the source, for example. Consider the source. What does this person know? What evidence are they bringing to bear? How likely is it that that evidence is trustworthy? How likely is it that that they're reporting what they actually heard? Okay, what is their reputation, right? Because reputation matters a lot. If someone has a reputation for hyperbole and stirring things up, you don't want to listen to them, even though what they're saying is carefully crafted to rile you up, right? To wind you up. You want to ask yourself, is this somebody who has a reputation for telling the truth? The things that they have reported and the things that they have said, okay, did it turn out to be true? Did it turn out, when all was said and done, were they accurate? Okay, were their predictions accurate? Were their descriptions accurate? I think it's an important topic. I think we don't have rules that I'm aware of anyway. I mean, in journalism, there may be. I think we do need some rules on this because, as we saw, as during this presidential election and what's going on with climate change, people are getting their information from extremely unreliable sources that, for specific reasons, they are more likely to trust. Okay. And it's because this person is like me. He's one of us. She's one of us. So she must be speaking the truth. That has to be attacked. Just because someone is one of us doesn't necessarily mean that they're truthful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a question. Can you hear me? May I speak?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Hi. Yeah. Thanks very much for
your.
thanks very much for your talk. My question is really about the moral judgment area, and if you say controversies are situated in these moral differences, how can I decide if in societal debate people are arguing according to very different values, but perhaps the arguments are very, very sound on both sides? How do I weigh these arguments? Am I weighing according to utility? Which argument wins?
Well, this is the thing about moral judgment. It's not like other forms of decision making, because there is a correct answer usually, right? We do know what the likelihood of breast cancer is in a particular situation. Whereas in moral judgment, it's not like that. It's based on I hate to use the word fuzzier, but things that are not cut and dried. Okay. What I found when I teach the sections on moral judgment is that it's illuminating to people to understand, first off, that there are these philosophical traditions. Okay, many of them only have been exposed to moral judgment within their religions, their churches, if at all. And if they're not particularly religious, they may not have been, the only thing they've gotten is let people live, and, they're not harming anybody. Okay, that's usually the rules that they're given. And so it's profoundly illuminating to them to know that there's been all of this deep thought going back for centuries about these matters, and that there are different schools, and that people, whether they understand it or not, whether they realize it or not, fall into these categories. So maybe one of the reasons why you've run up against a brick wall in trying to argue with somebody is so for example, is it okay to burn the American flag? Right. And to me, to a liberal, they're like, you shouldn't do that, but let's get, maybe a form of protest, right? But to someone who's extremely conservative, this violates, authority and patriotism. This is as much of a moral transgression, excuse me, as, murder, right? That's the way they think about it. Just understanding giving them a framework, okay, within which to understand these disputes helps them in some ways with their own moral judgments, okay? Other than that, how do we make these moral judgments? Okay, a lot of times we just make them, and sorry to sound like a consequentialist, but we see how it plays out. We repealed Roe versus Wade, and now women are being killed, right? They're not receiving the obstetric care that they need. So is that a good thing? Right? You may think that you're saving innocent babies, okay? But you have to see how this is playing out. And that hopefully will feed back and allow some kind of temperance in terms of our thinking about this. But that's the best I can tell you, is that when you teach these things, you can see people's minds open up, just like, oh, well, I always thought this was just the way it is, and everybody thought my way. This is just truth. When they are made aware of these other moral foundations and moral schools, they have more of an appreciation for why somebody might be arguing this other way, and feel just as strongly that they're in the right. Okay, whether they change their minds or not is a different matter. That's, again, a question of argumentation and persuasion and all the rest of that. But just being aware of it from what I've seen, makes a big difference.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
If I may, I've got a copy of
That's
the
it.
here. And I just recommend it to everyone strongly as a resource. If they don't use it as a textbook in their critical thinking class, I did a lot of the topics in here when I was teaching critical thinking, and this would have been very helpful, especially like how you pair the presentation in the earlier chapters of the specific things with the down in the weeds and the application. I think it makes things a bit more vivid. If we had more time, I'd ask you to talk about analogies, because when I was teaching critical thinking, we come to the notion of questionable analogies, and really I had very little to say other than, well, think about the similarities, but then think about the differences and see which ones are more important. And didn't have much beyond that to be able to tell students, except to just be on the lookout and to question analogies that were being used. I think your section in here on analogical reasoning at least brings some additional considerations to the fore that are relevant for people to think about. And so I'm recommending the book strongly, and thank you for your presentation today. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, the first edition I made more like a popular book. So it was more like the first part of the book. And then Cambridge said, well, why don't you sort of beef it up a little bit so it could possibly be used as a textbook. I didn't want to write a textbook because I didn't want to just direct it to a college audience. You know, I think everybody should know about these things. So I compromised, and the first part of the book, as you say, is kind of like the first edition of the book, just updated. The second part is called Into the Weeds, where I go really far more in depth into each one of these things. So you can get more of the nuts and bolts. And when I teach it, you know, I give them problem sets that they have to do so that they get used to how to do these things. So they not just know that they exist, but they have some idea of how you actually do it. How do you do Bayes' rule, right? How do you apply, you know, moral rules, you know, these kinds of things. So I'm glad you found it useful. That's great. Yeah, an analogy. It's like trying to get a fish to lecture on water. This is you know, this is the way the mind works, like Douglas Hofstadter said. And in AI, they rely on this a lot. This whole business about using analogies, okay, for finding relational things. But for a while in the late 80s, early 90s, there was an attempt in psychology to actually get into the weeds on this and come up with what essentially would have been an inductive logic for, you know, how to capture adequate analogies. And that's just not, you can't have an inductive logic. So what we have is a lot of guidelines for what makes a good analogy and what makes a poor one, and the frameworks within which, you know, are there causal connections, true causal connections with respect to these things, or are they just superficial similarities? Things like that. So there's a lot of rules and guidelines, and that's the best we've been able to come up with so far.
Could I just jump in here? I want to compliment you on using the ARS conditions. And I just think they're crucial.
Yeah.
If you don't work with some conditions for cogent reasoning and argumentation, then you're lost. You have nothing to, you know, you might wave your hands like Richard Paul and say, oh, use intellectual standards, but without telling people what they are.
Right.
That's just empty verbs. And I think Govier does a really nice job of applying those conditions for cogent reasoning, not only to get people to use them with respect to argument analysis, but she also uses it as a really nice way of rounding up the classic informal fallacies, which usually it's just a hodgepodge of goofy ass informal fallacies and a lot of don't do's. And you don't understand what the why the informal fallacy is fallacious. And to show how it violates one of the cogency conditions is a great way to bring that home.
Yes.
And the topic of appeal to authority was mentioned. And I think you did a really nice job of laying out the questions to be asking to see if indeed this is an appeal, a legitimate, a cogent appeal to authority or an appeal to false authority. I think he did a really nice job of that. But Govier would bring that under the heading of the acceptability condition. Is that an acceptable premise to cite this authority? And I think you could also bring it into the discussion of scientific reasoning, because that's a hypothesis too, is to, you're treating the authority as a kind of gauge or instrument like you do in scientific reasoning. And it's always a legitimate question to ask, is my equipment accurate? Okay, well functioning, that sort of thing. So again, I just, very nice job of bringing in those arse conditions. They're just crucial to everything.
I think so. Yeah, yeah, I agree. Especially this, the relevance, of things. That's why you can knock out some of these things. In terms of analogies or scientific reasoning, it's like, is there a causal connection there? If there isn't, then why are we talking about this, right?
Oh, well, and not all analogies are causal. Some are conceptual, okay? Especially in moral reasoning too. So don't lose sight of that. Okay.
No, I agree. That's that's a good point. In the problem solving literature, when they talk about using analogies, it's a question of whether there's a structural relation there or whether it's just superficial. So, classic case, you give physics problems to undergraduates and to physicists, and you say sort them, okay, and then solve them into categories. And the undergraduates will put all of the ones with inclined planes in a group and all the ones with springs in a group because they have superficial similarities. Whereas the physicists instead will sort them according to the physical principles that are being described, underneath the sort of latent content. And then, of course, when it comes time to solving the problems, right, the experts clean up because they've already sorted them properly. So yeah, that's an important, there are a lot of guidelines. Again, if I'd gone into the section on problem solving, there's a lot with respect to the use of analogies in problem solving, because you import knowledge, okay? When you're searching around for, how am I going to solve this problem? Have I solved a problem like this before? Okay, well, what is like this, right? This is like that. What is like this? And your problem solving success depends a lot on whether you're looking at structural similarities. They may be causal, they may be principled in some way, okay? And you import that in, you have a much better chance of solving the problem than if you're just comparing superficial similarities. Okay, so yeah, so I go into analogies, analogical reasoning more in that section. Yeah, but good point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Claude?
I have a question. The 7 categories that you describe all presuppose the basics of the construction and evaluation of arguments. And across the disciplines, there's thinking. But when I get students from, whether it's chemistry or whatever the discipline, they have just as many challenges as anyone else who is not majoring in science or math or any of those demanding disciplines. Our challenge, I think, is how can we work across disciplines to have a common vocabulary for the evaluation and construction of arguments, explanations, and claims? Because there's thinking, but when there's thinking across the disciplines, but when instructors teach their discipline, they're not making explicit the reasoning that is there present, even though there's demanding thinking. So when the students are then challenged to think outside of their discipline, there's no transference. If there were a way to, my question is, how can we get our colleagues across the disciplines on board on agreeing on a common standards that apply across disciplines, and how to impart those, teach those at crucial moments in each discipline? because the student will then start noticing repeating patterns across disciplines. And that is what is going to be reinforcing the reasoning and, what's really important, increasing the chances of transference. Because as we're blowing it as educators in making our students transfer their reasoning abilities outside of our respective disciplines. So how, it's a challenging question. How can we get our colleagues on board for us to work across the disciplines to agree on some common, which do exist, common critical thinking approaches, common vocabulary, making explicit the standards of reasoning?
Okay, well, what I'd say is that logic and argumentation is necessary in each one of these disciplines, and I think that's the lingua franca. Okay, when a scientist writes up, in designing an experiment, okay, there's a hypothetical deductive method. You have to deduce, okay, steps that need to be taken in order to test a hypothesis. When you present your scientific results, you need to do it you have to present an argument, and it has to be compelling. When you write a scientific paper, the same thing. In each one of these disciplines, okay, at some point you cannot avoid it. You are going to have to reason logically. You're going to have to deal with argumentation, and you're going to have to present coherent and cogent arguments to present your results, to develop your research strategies and so on. So I think that's the lingua franca. That's what all of these disciplines have in common. But that's not the only one. That is the bread and butter for, say, philosophy and for law. It is not for example, in science. You need the logic and you need the argumentation, but you also need to know how to do hypothesis testing. You need to know how to do a statistical analyses. You need to know, for example, what an analysis of variance is, or multiple regression. You need to know what rejection probability means, okay? In order to do your job as a scientist, you need to know these things. In economics, you need to know game theory. You need to know how that works. You need to know Bayes' theorem. You need to know how that works. You need to have those tools in the box. And those things are specific to those disciplines. And I think unless students take courses in that, okay, they don't learn them. And I think they should. That's why I said, the jewel in the crown is logic and argumentation. How to the R's conditions, okay, when you're assessing, because you're never going to escape that. That is always a crucial point. But there are these other tools that are discipline specific that most of us are ignorant of, and we shouldn't be.
Well, on that note, I think I will thank everybody for attending a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Cummins. This was fantastic.
Yeah,
and I will,
me.
and this will be up on the website hopefully later today. So
Okay,
thank you very
great.
much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.